If it's Thursday, a new era of Republican leadership begins. My conversation just this afternoon with President-elect Donald Trump and what he sees as his first priority when taking office as President Biden vows a peaceful transfer of power, unlike the disorder and violence of 4 years ago. Plus, a realignment is underway in American politics as Democrats face a reckoning, and the blame game begins. What's next as the party charts an uncertain path forward? And as the final votes are being counted, all eyes are on the fight for the House as Democrats hope they can win the majority to maintain their last line of political resistance against President-elect Trump's sweeping agenda. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington. As President-elect Donald Trump's transition to power now begins and Democrats grapple with the uncertain fate and future of their party, I spoke with President-elect Trump earlier this afternoon by phone as he and his team begin the transition process. The president-elect outlining his priorities for day one of his administration. Among them, taking action at the southern border, including implementing what he has called his mass deportation plan, regardless of the price tag. The president-elect also describing to me his calls with some 70 world leaders since his victory, including Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and President Zelensky of Ukraine, two conflicts that loomed large over the campaign, adding that he had not yet spoken with Russian President Putin, but believes he will. Mr. Trump also shared details of his conversations with President Biden and Vice President Harris since the election, calling them, quote, very nice calls, both respectful, both ways. Our conversation came after President Biden spoke from the White House today for the first time since the election, echoing remarks made by Vice President Harris yesterday, pledging a peaceful and orderly transition in contrast to the turmoil and the insurrection from 4 years ago.
Yesterday, I spoke with President-elect Trump to congratulate him on his victory, and I assured him that I'd direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition. Campaigns are contests of competing visions. The country chooses one or the other. We accept the choice the country made. I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win.
Now, the president-elect clearly buoyed by his victory, telling me in our conversation today that he believes he has a, quote, mandate to bring common sense back to the country after his decisive win, which saw him flip at least 4 battleground states, shattering the Democrats' blue wall and presiding over a national rightward shift that has taken the Democratic Party. Democrats, meanwhile, left to figure out what went wrong and what comes next, as Vice President Harris urged supporters to continue the fight during her concession speech yesterday.
In our nation, we owe loyalty not to a president or a party, but to the Constitution of the United States. And loyalty to our conscience and to our God. My allegiance to all three is why I am here to say, while I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
Now, of course, whether Democrats have any power in Washington to continue that fight all comes down to which party controls the House, which remains uncalled at this hour. But Republicans appear to have the easier path to winning a majority than Democrats. Republicans will control the Senate with at least a 2-seat majority, potentially more, once races are called in Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. It all means that President-elect Donald Trump will be taking the reins with potentially few checks against his power as he embarks on fulfilling promises made during his campaign. A long list that, if implemented, would fundamentally change this country and its institutions on the economy, foreign policy, and immigration. Joining me now from the White House is NBC's Mike Memoli, and Vaughn Hilliard is in West Palm Beach with the very latest from the Trump transition. Mike, let me start with you. it was notable in my conversation with President-elect Trump. He talked about the fact that Vice President Harris and President Biden both emphasized to him that they want a smooth and orderly transition. He said he totally agrees 100%. You heard that in their speeches, really emphasizing the importance of a peaceful transfer of power. It comes, of course, against the backdrop of what this country experienced 4 years ago, which was not a peaceful transfer of power. Mike, what's the thinking inside the administration right now?
Well, Kristen, I think we can predict that this 74 days before Donald Trump is sworn in as the next president of the United States will at times have some bumpy moments in this transition. It's almost inevitable that there will be conflicts and some tensions as these teams try to work with one another to prepare for this handoff of power. But it is striking to see how in the first 48 hours, both sides, and all three sides, in fact, have been trying to put their best foot forwards and act in a civil fashion, right? We've seen, as you illustrate from your conversation with the president-elect, as we even see in some of the statements from members of his team, usually very sharply worded, have all been very gracious and very positive at this stage. We saw the vice president yesterday, and then we saw President Biden today doing everything he could to both try to reassure his supporters, his staff, some of those who voted for Vice President Harris about the fact that there will be another day here, but also to try to put what we expected, I think, frankly, from President Biden. He's a person of norms and traditions who is going to extend every bit of graciousness to Donald Trump that he feels he was not extended 4 years ago. It's a sort of implicit contrast that has been a hallmark of President Biden. But I want you to listen to part of what the president said, in which I think he could send a message while still striking a positive tone. Take a listen.
I also hope we can lay to rest the question about the integrity of the American electoral system. It is honest, it is fair, and it is transparent. And it can be trusted, win or lose. I also hope we can restore the respect for all our election workers who busted their necks and took risks at the outset. We should thank them.
So, Kristen, you were with me at the White House 8 years ago. We remember just the shock of Obama staff at the time. Of course, President Biden was then the vice president. He experienced that as well. It's a different level, I think, of surprise and shock at this point, not necessarily because they had expected Vice President Harris to win. I think they certainly had hoped so, but because I think they fear what he might represent now, where he was much more of an unknown 8 years ago. So this is really the undercurrent with which President Biden has to proceed now to try to set the stage for this handoff of power.
Absolutely. And within that handoff of power, President-elect Trump telling me that the two had agreed to meet, to have lunch in the near future. Mike, you know, I've been talking to sources within the Democratic Party. The finger pointing has already begun. I was talking to one Democratic lawmaker who said this is a real moment of reckoning, that the Democratic Party, and as another source said, has got to do some soul searching to figure out how this decisive victory by Donald Trump was possible. What did they miss? What are you hearing in terms of that finger pointing that's already starting to take hold within the Democratic Party?
Yeah, it really started on Tuesday night as I was sharing with some of my sources what we were seeing in the exit polls, which pointed to a much closer result than many had hoped for. And very quickly, the first question was raised whether President Biden should have stayed in this race. I think the much more prevailing sentiment was, should he have stepped aside much earlier? Should he have even announced he was running at all? It was really interesting to hear Karine Jean-Pierre at the press briefing today. And if you look at some of the polling that showed President Biden with such a negative approval rating in this country, that the views of the economy were so negative, the White House press secretary tried to, sort of broadly speaking, say that this is not a problem unique to President Biden. She pointed to elections in democracies all over the world since the pandemic that show incumbent parties, incumbent administrations suffered pretty much across the board. And so I think one of the arguments that's most interesting from the Biden perspective is that because Vice President Harris took pains to try to distance herself from the president, no one was making a positive argument about what this administration did, essentially conceding the economic issue to Trump, and that was clearly decisive on Election Day.
A really fascinating point, Mike Memley. Thank you for that, Vaughn. Let me turn to you. I know you're working your sources trying to get the very latest on the Trump transition, which is now officially underway. I tried to get some details from President-elect Trump, didn't get very far. I asked him for example, if Susie Wiles, someone who has managed his campaign, is one of the top choices for chief of staff. He certainly had high praise for her, talked about the fact that he thought she would be a very good pick. What are you hearing? Have any decisions been made yet?
Right, this is the moment where there are a lot of names swirling about. Those names that are going to be very legitimate contenders to be added to the administration, but then also those that are sort of at the last minute trying to throw their names back into the equation. And that's what we're actively, I know as a team, Kristen, trying to do is sort through those realities. There has been already a transition team that has been in the works now for the last several weeks, even before Donald Trump's election this week. And it's led by Howard Lutnick and Linda McMahon. And those are the two individuals. I'm told Howard Lutnick is really focused on the personnel side. Linda McMahon really focused on the policy side of this, that are getting ready for just 2 months from now when Donald Trump takes the reins of a White House that is expansive, not only needing to fill the cabinet posts, but also the 3,000 political appointees that ultimately staff out those departments in those agencies. And I want to let folks just take a look at some of the names who we at NBC News are told are, in fact, under consideration here in Palm Beach to go into those key cabinet posts. When you look at Secretary of State, you have the likes of Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who we are told is under the consideration, but also the likes of Rick Grinnell, who was a former acting director of national intelligence. Over at the Pentagon, Senator Tom Cotton was under consideration, but publicly is now taking himself out of the running for contention. You also have, though, the likes of Congressman Mike Waltz of Florida, who was a Green Beret and somebody who was a frequent presence on the campaign trail alongside of Donald Trump as well as on the TV airwaves. The big one, of course, is also going to be the next Attorney General. Donald Trump has big ideas for what his AG he wants him to execute on come 2025. And we are now told here this afternoon that there are at least 3 names who are under serious consideration. That being, number one, Mark Paoletta, who was the former general counsel to the OMB in the first Trump administration, and then 2 other names who are maybe more publicly recognizable. That includes the likes of Matt Whitaker, who served as acting attorney general during his first term after Jeff Sessions left the AG post. And then also, I'm told Eric Schmidt by 2 sources, the senator from Missouri, is under consideration. He has also been traveling in recent weeks with Donald Trump, the now president-elect. Over at DHS, we're told that Chad Wolf, who was the former acting DHS secretary at the end of his first term, is under consideration. So, as you said, there's a lot going on. Susie Wiles, that was an important question to him because she was that one of the 2 campaign managers, and we didn't see actually that many palace intrigue stories over the last 2 years of his campaign. And the large part was because of the way that Susie Wiles ran the campaign. From sources that we talked to, a great many would be eager to see her fill that post in order to ensure that there's a clean transition into the actual White House, Kristen.
All right, Vaughn Hilliard, great reporting. As always, keep us updated if you get any new developments while you're there. Really appreciate it. We want to turn now to the economy and inflation issues, which proved pivotal in Tuesday night's election. Today, the Federal Reserve announcing a 0.25% interest rate cut. It's the second rate cut in 3 months and further indication that inflation is cooling. The Labor Department reported last month that the rise in consumer prices slowed in September to their lowest pace since February of 2021, President Biden's first month in office. It also comes as President-elect Donald Trump has vowed to lower prices for American consumers when he takes office through imposing tariffs, even though experts agree tariffs are more likely to raise prices. NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung joins me now. So, Brian, what's the big takeaway from the Fed's decision today?
Yeah, well, Kristen, what the Federal Reserve did could lead to marginally lower borrowing costs for your credit cards, for your auto loans. Let's unpack a little bit more about exactly what they did. Just a few hours ago, the Federal Reserve announcing that they cut interest rates in this country by 0.25 percentage point. This is the second move after already cutting interest rates by 0.5% in September. And the big reason why? Because of improvements on inflation. You just saw that chart of you ahead of you on the consumer price index. This is a measure of the yearly rate of price increases in this country. And yes, voters felt that when they went to the poll, they were voting off of the memories of the peak inflation that we saw in the summer of 2022 when prices were rising in this country at the tune of something like 9% on a yearly rate. Now we're seeing something closer to 2.4%. So that's why the Federal Reserve said, you know what, we raised interest rates so dramatically to try to take that number down. That largely did its job. Now they can take their foot off of the pedal by lowering interest rates. And that's what the Federal Reserve did today. And by the way, the Fed Chairman Jay Powell saying nothing had to do with the election in their decision to cut interest rates today, Kristen.
Well, and let's talk about President-elect Trump's, some of his policies. The centerpiece, really, of his economic plan is tariffs and slapping tariffs on goods that are coming in from other countries. Of course, the criticism with that is that ultimately that gets borne out by the consumer. What are people saying about his plan as they prepare for him to actually start to implement that? I should say I tried to ask him about that as well, but we really focused more on the border issue.
Yeah, and look, by the way, tariffs are something that the president could do in his first few days in office. He could get the U.S. Trade Representative's office to do that. But we have to remember that in 2018, he was using that largely as a bargaining chip. So it was the threat of imposing tariffs that was largely the story before he actually did so on China. But look, what he has proposed to do, at least in the campaign trail, is to do a dramatic tariff on specifically China, 60% on anything coming into this country from China. And by the way, not just China, 10% blanket tariff for anything coming in from any other country into the United States. But here's the question. As Americans still continue to feel the pinch and pain of inflation, economists that I have spoken to have said, look, when it comes to these tariffs, that's a cost that importers have to pay when they bring things in to the United States. So if you're a company, you make something in another country, you bring it into the United States, you have that extra tariff. What do you do with that tariff? In many cases, you pass on that added cost to the consumer. That would be inflationary. We'll have to see whether or not that is the case once Trump gets into his first few days in the office.
Yeah, we will have to wait and see. There was this fascinating moment, Brian, when Jerome Powell was asked about what he would do if Donald Trump asked him to resign. He said he wouldn't, but walk through specifically what he said and frankly, the implications of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to kind of backtrack a little bit and offer a bit of history because Jerome Powell is only in the chair spot at the Federal Reserve because who? Donald Trump, who appointed him in his first term. Now you have Trump saying on the campaign trail that he thinks he could do a better job than current Fed officials. In August, he was quoted as saying that he thinks he has better instinct than Fed officials and would like to have a say in what the independent central bank does. So there was a question posed to the Fed chairman this afternoon that was asked very plainly. Would you resign if the president asked you to do so? He said a very quick no. And another follow-up question was, does the president have the legal authority to do so in the first place? He also said no. So Jerome Powell, who was put in place by the Trump administration, saying he would not step down if the president asked him to do so. But of course, his term does end at some point, and then the president would be able to appoint someone new. All
right. Well, there you have it. Really fascinating stuff. Brian Chung, thank you so much. Always great to see you. Appreciate it. Coming up, an update from the big board as the balance of power in Congress is still hanging in the balance. Will Republicans and President-elect Trump have full control of Washington or not? That's next. Plus, new reporting on how the Biden administration is preparing for a potential surge of migrants at the southern border after Trump told me today that he, quote, has no choice but to launch that massive deportation operation once he's in office that he's been talking about on the campaign trail. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. When all the votes are counted, Republicans may have full control of Washington. Right now, which party will win the House is still up in the air, with 34 races still undecided. Democrats are clinging to the hope that they'll retain some power in Congress. It comes as both the House Democratic Caucus and House Republican Conference were expected to hold virtual meetings today. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale has been following all the key House races and has the very latest.
Kristen, I know that we had been telling viewers to exercise patience on the presidential call. Ultimately, that came sooner than we thought that it would, or at least that some thought that it would. Still, the House map is one that will require patience, in large part because many of the seats that we're still waiting on are here out west in areas like California or Oregon, especially Alaska, areas that just take a little bit longer to call, be it because of large vote-by-mail populations and other reasons of just needing to count every vote because some of these races can be so close. But really, the magic number is, as always, 218. Usually we talk about that number from a legislating and margins perspective. This one is just who gets to control the House and thusly all of the gavel power, subpoena power, committee chair power that comes along with it. You can see here Republicans are closer than Democrats at this point. Democrats at 192 seats, Republicans at 209 seats. I think the thing that's striking, though, about this map is it really became a story of the more things change, the more they kind of stay the same. We have ended up seeing some seats be able to flip. Here's a smattering of them on the screen, and there's not many. But the story of this is less a matter of Republicans and Democrats clobbering each other in their districts. Instead, it's more a story of redistricting and the impact of gerrymandering in two key states. For Democrats, one of their two flips have at this point come from Alabama's redistricting process. For Republicans, it's these 3 seats in North Carolina. When North Carolina released its new map, multiple members of that North Carolina delegation either found other things to run for or just left their congressional seats behind, choosing not to run for re-election. So that is one of the key stories that we're following in terms of how the flips on this map actually ended up happening. But the key races that tell stories of Republicans replacing Democrats happened here in Michigan's 7th congressional district. This is the seat vacated by now Senator Alyssa Slotkin. And then Pennsylvania's 7th congressional district, as well as the 8th congressional district, are stories of really the way that Trump himself was able to remake the map in Pennsylvania and the impact of that as you get further down the ballot. When you talk about races that we're still looking at here, again, it underscores the point. We're waiting for a lot in California. It's these over here. There's also some key New York races that are going to be central, especially as Democrats try to retake the majority. But it's a narrow path for them at this point. Even as my sources try to express optimism, many of them are recognizing that it's likely that now President-elect Trump will come into Washington the way that he did in 2017, with control of the White House, control of the Senate, and likely control of the House, too. Kristen?
All right. We'll continue to watch it. Ali Vitale, thank you. Well, whether or not Republicans win the House, it's worth noting that the circumstances and strength of President-elect Trump's power in the Republican Party are vastly different than when he won the last time. The Trump skeptics who controlled the House and Senate Republican conferences have been replaced by individuals who owe their standing to Trump. And from top to bottom, today's Republican Party is largely built in Trump's image. So is the Supreme Court, which significantly expanded the scope of presidential power by ruling that all presidents now have absolute immunity for official acts. Joining me now on set is NBC News senior national politics reporter Sahil Kapur and Stephen Hayes, editor of The Dispatch and an NBC News contributor. Thanks to both of you for being here. So, Sahil, I spoke with President-elect Trump. He said he believes he has a mandate to bring common sense back to the country. What do you make of that?
Well, the biggest question is how much power the president is going to have through Congress. Now, you talk to him a lot about the border. He can do some of that by himself through executive action, reimpose the policies that he put in that President Biden unraveled. He can do a lot on tariffs by himself as well through executive action. But the things he's going to need Congress for, money to carry out a lot of those things. He's going to need a Republican Congress to give him money if he wants to do mass deportation. Going to need a whole lot more money for that. And two of the biggest questions right now are the size of his House majority. Republicans have not clinched the House yet, but they're on pace to have a narrow majority. It's not going to be a big majority, smaller than his 2017 one. And then, of course, the Senate, the filibuster is still there for any wholesale regulatory changes that he would like to make.
Well, Stephen, I talked to the president-elect about the House. He seemed very bullish as well. Obviously, the numbers show that he will have control of, that Republicans will have control of the House ultimately. What do you make of that extraordinary sort of expansion of power, the fact that Republicans will control now the White House and both chambers of Congress, and that ideologically, at least, there is a conservative tilt to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, two main points. The first is to echo the point that you just made. It's different now than it was in 2017. Yeah. The people who are Trump skeptics, and were Trump skeptics in 2017, many of them have left Congress. There was always this group of members of Congress who would talk to people like the three of us quietly on the side and say, well, this is what he's saying, this is what I'm saying publicly, and I'm saying something a little bit different privately. Yeah. But now, as you point out, a lot of these people are here because of Donald Trump, because of their loyalty to Donald Trump. They ran on his issues, and I think you can expect them to be loyal. One of the biggest questions I have about this new Washington, D.C., how many of those people who are really not with him are sort of old school conservatives will be willing to speak up in this Trump-dominated environment. And then the second point I would make just quickly on the House, I think we're going to come to look at the House as the tool for Donald Trump's retribution agenda. He ran on retribution for 3 years. He meant it. I think we should assume that he meant it. And the House, particularly with the Oversight Committee and with the power that they have to subpoena and to go after, for instance, the January 6th committee and the January 6th committee members that they didn't like, I think that's the place where a lot of those investigations will take place.
Sahil, pick up on that point. I mean, do you see it playing out in the House? Is that where this retribution agenda is going to take place?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's why the stakes for the House are so massive, especially when you know that President Trump is going to be in the White House with a Republican-led Senate. It's either going to be in the hands of Speaker Mike Johnson or someone else who is very loyal to Donald Trump, or he's going to have to be dealing with a potential Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries, who would use that power against the administration, at least to investigate the Trump administration. That power will be used very, very differently. And this, to Steve's point, this might prevent Trump from trying to use the Justice Department to go after his political enemies in ways that he suggested he would, which would be extremely controversial if he tried. It might come across a little bit differently if he, tweeted something and his political allies tried to pick up on it.
It's a great point. Let's talk about what we know so far about how the administration may or may not take shape. We're hearing Susie Wiles is one of the people who's being eyed as a potential chief of staff. There are other names on that list, but she obviously ran his campaign. A lot of people think it was his most disciplined campaign so far. We're also hearing about RFK Jr. He said himself that he's eyeing RFK Jr., Stephen, to come in and do health care. Elon Musk. What do you make of those names so far that we're and the list goes on and on? Marco Rubio potentially for Secretary of Defense or National Security Advisor. What are you hearing?
Well, I mean, you've covered him as closely as anybody. None of this will matter until Donald Trump makes a decision, and he'll call all of his people, and he'll say, "What do you think about this?" And he'll call people who appear on television and people he likes and trusts, and say, "What do you think about this?" And then ultimately he'll make the decision. The interesting thing in just 48 hours of making phone calls and trying to get a sense of who's really part of this is everybody thinks they're the leading contender for these things. So they're all out, launching sort of quiet campaigns. There was out external campaigns on behalf of Susie Wiles. You had Charlie Kirk, the right-wing media personality, agitating for her, pointing for her to get the job. We're going to see this. I mean, I think it's going to be like a series of campaigns, some of them subtle and behind the scenes, some of them quite open for people who want these plum jobs.
The one thing I'll predict is there will not be another John Kelly, another James Mattis, people who saw their job as being restraining some of his impulses that they thought were dangerous.
And what is the potential impact of that, Sahil? I mean, both on a practical matter, but also this is someone who likes to, what Trump world allies typically call spitball ideas with those who are in his cabinet, in his administration. What do you think functionally the potential impact of that is?
Well, the most important thing is there'll be loyalists that he'll stack his administration with. That matters when he's sitting around the table, the kind of advice he gets, whether people are going to tell him things he doesn't want to hear, whether people are going to disagree with him and make points in opposition. He did have that in his first term, whether or not he wanted it. There were a lot of people who he had to get through the Senate who were old school Republicans. This time around, whether it's 52 seats that we know he has, they might pad that margin a little bit. There are many fewer Senate Republicans who are going to be standing up to Trump.
I think I'd add another layer of nuance there. I think you have the Trump sycophants. These people who will do anything the president asks and probably push him to go further than he might instinctively want to go. You had the previous, the adults in the room, whatever we wanted to call them, the people who push back on those things. I think there's another category, and those are the people who are loyal to the president, who will do his bidding, but are also serious about world events and think about sort of big picture things and understand the threats from foreign adversaries. Somebody like a John Ratcliffe, who was DNI in the first term, but there was lots of reporting about John Ratcliffe in the days after the 2020 election when Trump was pushing Stop the Steal, quietly saying around the White House, hey, this is not a great idea. So somebody nobody doubts John Ratcliffe was loyal to Donald Trump. But there was a point at which he said, enough is enough. And I think there's a category of those kind of people. I'd put Marco Rubio in that category.
I was going to say Marco Rubio. Yeah, absolutely.
Rubio pushed back on some things in the first term. Kellogg, sometimes.
Last thing, if I can add,
please.
he will still have to deal with Democrats in Congress on some really big things. There's another round of government funding coming up. That is subject to the 60-vote threshold. He's going to need to cut a deal with them. There's another debt limit deadline coming up next year to prevent a global economic meltdown. He's going to have to deal with Democrats for that.
Well, you raised an interesting point, and one top Republican said to me that Republicans would be strategic to try to take some of those things off the table before the inauguration. Is there any realistic world where that could potentially get done?
Government funding? Probably not. They have a deadline coming up December 20th. It's highly unlikely they're going to come up with a deal, especially when they know they can rewrite the bill to their liking in the Trump administration. The debt limit deadline, certainly not. They're not going to pass another debt limit extension before that. So that's going to be a problem, at least a challenge that he's going to have to find a way around, in addition to his expiring tax cuts. More than $3 trillion of tax cuts at the end of next year.
Well, Stephen, I was going to give you the last word on tax cuts, because that's obviously one of his big campaign promises. He's going to extend the Trump-era tax cuts.
Something he ran on, and certainly something that Reagan-style old-school Republicans are also in favor of.
All right. Well, a lot to watch as this transition gets underway. Sahil, Stephen, great to see you both. Thanks for being here. Coming up next, how the world is reacting to President-elect Trump's victory and what it could mean for the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. You're watching Meet the Press now. Stay with us. Welcome back. After Donald Trump's decisive victory, Democrats face a reckoning and questions about what the future of their party looks like everywhere. They didn't just lose key battlegrounds on Tuesday night. They also lost ground in reliably blue states as well. Right now, Kamala Harris is up just 5 points in New Mexico. Joe Biden won it by more than 10 points. Same story in New Jersey. Kamala Harris is up about 5 points right now, with about 91% of the ballot in. Joe Biden won it by about 16 points in 2020. Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders responded to those results with this scathing indictment for Democrats, saying, quote, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign?" He goes on to say in this scathing statement, will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? And then he ends this really tough statement by saying, probably not. Joining me now on set is Faz Shakur, senior advisor to Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders, the perfect person to talk to today, and former Democratic Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, another perfect person to talk to. Thank you guys for being here. Faz, let me start with you. Let's start right there with what Bernie Sanders said. What do you make of it? Is it fair? Because some Democrats, including Jamie Harrison, DNC chair, are saying it's not terribly fair because he is someone who's praised Biden's handling of the economy and his outreach.
As has Bernie Sanders.
Class. Yeah.
As has Bernie Sanders. Let's be clear about that. But so,
yeah, no, right.
Choosing how to run a campaign, that's the debate we're having. Mm-hmm. Do we make aggressive appeals to working class people? And these are well-intentioned people who ran the Kamala Harris campaign. They're not bad people, but they made certain decisions. You make a decision to say, I want to go stand with Mark Cuban. I want him to tell everybody about economic policy. You stand with Liz Cheney. I want to speak to Haley voters. You say, hey, I want to step back from capital gains taxes. I don't want to animate fights against Big Pharma. I don't want to talk about fights that we're doing at the FTC. I can't comment on Lena Khan. These are choices. These are just choices that you make. Yeah. And when you make those choices, you should also see, like, hey, are we going to say anything about expanding Social Security? Are you going to say anything about raising the minimum wage? We have to fight with them internally and externally to try to move them on those questions. And while the Democratic Party is there, people are asking, what do you animate? What's your fights? What do you care about? What drives you? And on those questions, you know, it was a slog, and I felt like we didn't animate enough on the working class contrast with Donald Trump.
Stephanie, pick up on that point, because I spoke with one Democratic lawmaker who said, in addition to everything Faz is saying, it's not even just about laying out policies. It's about finding that way to connect with voters on a visceral level, to basically say, I understand that you are hurting, that you are struggling to pay your bills, that when you go to the grocery store, it's too expensive. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say that it's beyond campaigning. This actually, this problem started with the Biden administration, with Biden running as a moderate, but then governing as a progressive and out of step with the American people. And then, moreover, when the American people told him they were hurting, he said, no, inflation's transitory. Oh, no, can't you see the economy is good? Despite the fact that people couldn't afford the groceries they needed anymore. And I think you don't have to look much further than the moderates in the Democratic Party to see how Democrats can connect with working class people. There are moderates who are going to win this cycle. Their races are closing. It looks pretty good. Who are running against the headwinds of the Democratic brand, but are winning in places where they've connected to the working class. And I think they'll be calling Maine here for Golden. Look at Slotkin in Michigan. These are members who have figured out how to speak to the working class and to win in their districts. And in this postmortem, I think Democrats would do well to look at their own members.
What about that, Faz? I mean, it's part of the argument that you're making, but basically saying, look, you can make it from a moderate standpoint.
You can. That's right. I mean, as long as you know your goal is to speak to working class pain and suffering. And Jared Golden's doing Martin Revolution campaign. There were a number. I love Becca Cook, who ran in Wisconsin. There were people coming from working class backgrounds with their own stripes, their own ideas, saying, hey, the power is corporate America has too much power over your economic freedom. I'm going to fight for you. I want government authority to work on behalf of you. Maybe I don't subscribe to everything that Bernie Sanders says. Maybe I don't subscribe to everything Joe Biden says. Maybe I don't subscribe to certain things that Democrats say. But you know that my animus in life, what I fight for, is for your economic freedom against those who are trying to take it away from you. And I just don't think on that score we met the bar of on the Harris campaign of animating that contrast. And saying that was the main thing we want to do. Why does Trump go to McDonald's? Why does he wear a garbage shoe? He's trying to speak to working class people. He's trying to animate that as a contrast that you want to frame well.
You know, it's interesting because one person said to me, this is a reckoning. There needs to be a moment of reckoning within the Democratic Party, that it's that serious, particularly when you look at the fact that Trump expanded his support amongst Latinos, with black voters, with suburban voters. And he even chipped away at Harris's lead in some reliably blue counties and won some blue counties that Biden won last cycle. Stephanie, how should this moment of reckoning unfold? Is this about new leadership? Is it about a new generation? Where do you begin?
You know, this moment of reckoning actually exists within an ongoing political realignment of the parties. And so the parties are now, the Republican Party is now more affiliated with non-college educated working class voters, and the Democratic Party more affiliated with urban college educated workers. But the problem is that the party has allowed those college educated workers, college educated people to run the party. And they're not the ones that are best suited to tailor a message to the working class people. And in fact, the messages that they tailor and the policies that they put out feel condescending to somebody who is working class. And that's why the disconnect has happened, is that the party is being run by a bunch of college educated people who don't have the lived experience, who are trying to create policy to help working class people. But that's not the American spirit. The American spirit is about equal opportunity, not equal outcomes.
I see where you're pointing to. I mean, I would say that the Trump campaign and people are college educated, but appealing successfully to working class people. So I'm not sure that's the diagnosis, but I want to offer one as a solution. How could we solve for this problem? I hope that, we're going to have an open DNC chair race here in a new construct of a DNC. I'd like that DNC chair, whoever it might be, to come in and say one of the goals and jobs of this organization, the Democratic Party is not just a fundraising vehicle. It is a grassroots party. We're going to go out to the country. We're going to go to Wisconsin and Texas and New York. You name the states, Virginia, New Jersey. We're going to listen to people. I want to hold listening sessions in which people who voted for Trump, maybe you voted Obama, Trump, whoever you might be, you voted for Trump, you are purposefully and intentionally invited in, and we're going to ask you some basic questions. What do you think of the Democratic brand? What's the strengths and the weaknesses? What do you want us to be talking about? What do you not like us talking about? And listen. And take some notes and reconstruct a party on that, because we can all have our thoughts and ideas, but it should stem, I think, from working class attitudes.
And I agree with you. I always ran in a district that was evenly split between Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and I started every term out with a listening session where I would go give opening remarks and then just take incoming and really try to understand where people are. And I think the other piece that you're right about is that the DNC and the Democratic operation has to be engaged with voters all the time, not just in the on year when they're looking to campaign, because people see through that. How many people in black communities would say to me, your party only shows up to talk to us in the on year? Like, where are you all in the off year? And I think it's important to do this grassroots work starting now.
so many people I've spoken to, Faz, made that point, that it can't just be a last-minute outreach. And frankly, it can't be an outreach to this group and that group, that it has to be an outreach to, I understand the problems that you're facing in your lives, not just which racial background you come from, and that sometimes, and that goes to the point about feeling like there's a condescension element there.
Yes, I agree with all that. And I would say, let me be constructive again here, say that the brand of being a Democrat, I own it, you own it, it should mean something. It should mean something, an affiliation, not just that you're a donor of whatever amount you give. It should mean something of being part of something. What does it mean to be part of the Democratic Party? And I think it's a harder bar for us because we believe in government. We believe the government should do stuff. So if you believe that a lot of that vote out there is feeling a bit betrayed by a party that believes in government. You guys believe in government? It doesn't do jack for me. I'm upset about it. And so therefore the bar is higher for us to go connect with them and say, you need to be of service. We're going to be of service to you. You're going to be of service to us. There are things to do in the local community. There are things to do in this state to help each other. When a union is organizing to help win an election, guess what? We as a party are going to get involved to help you win that election. Why? Because we're of service in this community. When you're fighting to reduce your utility rate and taking on fights against utility regulators, we're going to be involved with you. That's of service, right, in a community beyond just you give money to this party.
Well, it's so fascinating to hear your insights as this hard look that the Democratic Party is doing right now at itself gets underway. We really appreciate your perspective. Thank you so very much, Faz and Stephanie. Coming up after the break, the future of U.S. relations with America's allies and adversaries after Mr. Trump's victory. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we've said, President-elect Trump told me today he's spoken to probably, he says, 70 world leaders since Wednesday morning as they prepare to work with a second Trump administration. Among those leaders, President Zelensky and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who are both seeking sustained U.S. support amid the war in Ukraine and the escalating conflict in the Middle East. Chinese President Xi also extended a congratulatory message to President-elect Trump, urging cooperation between the two countries, even as Mr. Trump vows to impose massive tariffs on U.S. imports. Joining me now is NBC News chief Washington correspondent and chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, thank you for being here.
Well, what a fascinating conversation.
It was.
I am stunned. 70
leaders?
foreign
I said 70. He said yes, probably 70.
That's in 24 hours, basically.
Yes.
That's amazing.
He said the calls have been coming in nonstop. What do you make of the fact, Andrea, he's spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu, not a surprise, spoken to President Zelensky, said he's spoken to the leaders of France and Italy, the EU. He said he hasn't spoken yet to President Putin, though he anticipates he will.
Well, President Putin actually was at a meeting in Sochi, gave a speech, said he was congratulating Donald Trump, was ready to speak to him. And it's clear they're going to speak. In fact, there is reliable reporting that they've spoken at least several times. Bob Woodward wrote as many as 7 times since he's been out of the office. And when asked about it, he didn't deny it. Donald Trump, when he was candidate, he said it would be a smart thing to do. So that is one of the issues that is sort of hanging over everyone, especially over President Zelensky. It's no surprise that President Zelensky quickly called President-elect Trump. He is so nervous about the relationship between Trump and Putin. They've been very close, as you know, for all of these years. And he has said he could resolve the Ukraine war in 24 hours. And that means forcing Zelensky to the negotiating tables, which would mean territorial concessions to Vladimir Putin.
What do you think, Andrea, zooming out on that point? I mean, he has, when I interviewed him over a year ago, when he was just starting his campaign, really dug in on this idea that, yes, it is possible to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. As you say, a lot of experts saying, yes, that would mean territory, and it's also just not realistic. Zelensky has indicated that. What do you think a Trump foreign policy looks like, and how do you think world leaders are looking at this moment?
World leaders, depending on their perspectives, you've got MBS, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, delighted. The other Persian Gulf leaders have long been critical of former President Obama, of the Biden administration. They see him as someone they can do business with. Look, he went on his first foreign trip as president, President Trump, to Saudi Arabia. That's never done. Usually presidents go to either Mexico or Canada, to their closest geographic neighbors. So he was signaling to Riyadh a very big interest in that. His son-in-law and former White House aide, Jared Kushner, is basically in business with Saudi Arabia. $2 billion of the investment to start up his hedge fund came from the Saudi government fund. So that is a very close relationship. Other world leaders in Western Europe are very nervous because of his criticism of NATO, of alliances, undercutting alliances with Japan, South Korea. Also the threats of tariffs on China. European leaders are hedging their bets and thinking about doing more trade with China because they're worried about the reliability of the economic stability of the United States.
And Andrea, just finally, I mean, when you look at the war in the Middle East, which has consumed so much of this past year and several months, how might that be impacted? Will it be? I mean, right now, the United States continues to give weapons and financial support. What changes?
Big change, because Netanyahu, critics have said in his own country and elsewhere that he was holding back on a ceasefire and hostage release plan in Gaza, just fired the defense minister who was pushing for exactly that, an end of the war in Gaza and release of the hostages as the top priority, to hold out for Donald Trump because he believes he will have free reign under Donald Trump, who has been his closest ally. Just another thing, there's a lot of talk in the intelligence communities. They're very nervous about some of the names being proposed to head CIA, DNI. A lot of people are talking about retiring, taking retirement and going into the private sector. There'll be a big brain drain if some of these more controversial names come to the fore.
Fascinating reporting. Andrea, thank you so much for bringing us all your great reporting and insights. Great to see you as always. And still to come, we will have the very latest on Trump's plans for the southern border, the potential fallout, and how the Biden administration's already preparing. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. President-elect Trump ran a campaign vowing sweeping action at the southern border and mass deportations. And this afternoon, he told me that he partially credited his message on immigration as a reason why he won. And now NBC News has exclusive reporting that the Biden administration is preparing for a possible migrant surge amid concern from the immigrant community that President-elect Trump will shut down the border once he takes office. NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley helped break that story. She joins me now. Julia, thank you so much for being here. So let's dive right in. What actions is the current administration taking to prepare for this potential surge?
Well, we know, Kristen, that there was a meeting that DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas held on Monday, even before we knew the results of the election, where they said, look, if there's a Trump win, we know we need to be prepared for a possible surge because so many people will try to come in before he takes office. And they've actually been enjoying relatively low numbers, the lowest right now of illegal border crossings at any point in this administration. But they're worried that could change. So they're looking at things like bed space, manpower, how quickly they can deport people to certain countries so that they don't have a crisis on their hands and have the relative calm that they see right now at the border fall apart before the end of the administration.
I was able to speak with President-elect Trump. I asked him about his top priorities. He believes he has a mandate to lead. He did cite trying to secure the border, trying to make it safe and strong. He said, he talked about, of course, and I pressed him on what he's talked about so frequently on the campaign trail, his mass deportation plan. You had some reports that he may consider compelling police departments to help with those deportations by withholding federal grants. Do you have any new details on that, Julia?
You know, what I keep hearing, Kristen, is that there's really nothing set in stone until Trump himself announces it. So many people have been burned in the past. You think about Project 2025 coming out and saying what he's going to do, and he says, no one knows what I'm going to do until I do it. But I do know that that is one of the tools that's been under consideration, which is to withhold these federal DOJ grants to sanctuary cities if they don't hand over immigrants to ICE that they encounter in law enforcement, and even to some extent if they don't help ICE identify undocumented immigrants, potential migrants with criminal convictions living in their communities. That's even a step further than they went in the previous administration when they tried to withhold these funds. We should note then they were subject to a lawsuit, but they believe now they could get around that The other thing, Kristen, and I'm wondering if that's also coming through in your reporting, is that, Trump feels so emboldened by this win. They see it as a mandate, and they also see the way the entire American public has shifted to the right on immigration just in the last 4 years. They feel like they have the political wins at their back now to go much further than they did even during the first Trump administration, which really was the introduction of some of the most draconian, harshest, and frankly inhumane policies when it comes to separating families that we've really seen ever on immigration.
You're absolutely right, Julie, about the fact that he was definitely, when I spoke to him, emboldened and feels like he said it was the biggest mandate in 100 years. So it gives you a sense of just how bullish he is feeling after his decisive victory. Julia Ainsley, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I am back with more Meet the Press Now tomorrow, but the news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.